In the previous video, we looked at creating a custom class named comics.cs, and then in our main program, creating an array to hold instances of those comic characters, and we can set an element of that array and pass it the data that we want to populate that array element. So we're going to do this in Visual Studio. I'm going to make one slight change, and as we're going to read the data in from a text file, and then parse out that text file and populate the array that way. But we'll still use the comics constructor. Let's first take a look at the sample application of what we're going to create. So I have the interface here with several buttons, one of which is getting the data. And the getting data button will, when we click it, will access this text file through an open file dialog box, and then read this text into our custom class that we're going to create. It then is also going to enable these other three buttons as far as how we're going to show the data. The data is going to show up in a list box in terms of the first name and last name, and then when we click an item in the list box, it will show some information about that, which we're going to format that from our class. So looking at our text file, again, the format is a comma delimited file, and the first row is a header of first name, last name, strip, type, cartoonist, and year. And then our data follows. So when we read this, we're going to kind of ignore that first line, and then all our data will come in from lines 2 through the end. Let's try this out. I'm going to click the Get Data. I'm going to go find my file. There's my file. I'm going to click Open. It read in 34 records from the data file, so we can add and subtract records from the data file. Always work regardless of how many records there are. Although I did set up internally using an array of limiting it to 100 records. We'd have to change that if we had more than 100. And in a few weeks, we'll look at other collections, such as using a list or an array list, which I think are better ways than doing arrays, but we just haven't gotten there yet. So there are some restrictions that we have in terms of creating this file. As we create our class, we're going to see down the road there's better ways to do some of the things we're going to do today in this class example, such as using properties rather than just public fields. But for now, it read in 34 records. I'm going to click OK. There is all my information in terms of the data that it brought in. And I can click one of these records, and it shows me some information about the character, who it was drawn by, when it first appeared, and in what comic strip, and then it calculates the age based on when it first appeared versus the year of today. Now I can limit my list to showing only the human characters, because some of these are animals. And then in the human characters I can click an item, or I can show only the cat characters, or show only the dog characters. And to make this work, we're going to have two arrays, one of which is going to be a master list, one of which is going to be the displayed list. So let's go into Visual Studio and look at how to create our class. I'm in Visual Studio 2017, and I'm going to create a new Windows Form project. Since this is Unit 15 of our cohort, even though it's Week 1 of the CIS 262 course, I'm going to call this 15 Comics class. So I'm going to say OK. Here's my form. By now you know how to create the interface using Windows Forms and the toolbox and the controls. I'm going to show you the storyboard, and then you can recreate this form. I'm not going to take the time to walk you through that because by now you've mastered that. So here's our storyboard. We have 4 buttons: btn get data, btn show humans, btn show cats, btn show dogs. On these 3 buttons, the humans, cats, and dogs, I've set the enable property to false, so they're grayed out initially until we load the data. It's just a nice little feature to keep users from doing things they shouldn't be allowed to do until something else has happened. So they need to load the data before they can query the different types of characters. Then I have a list box over here named LST characters. That's going to be where we're going to show the different characters, that either all of them or the humans, the cats, and the dogs, and which characters I'm showing will be displayed in this LBL data header label. And then I have a label down here called LBL info. And of course on this one I set the auto size to false, gave it a little border. I want to make sure it can show 3 lines of text. You can pause the video here and based on these instructions, create the interface. Alright, so here's the interface created. Just a couple things I didn't point out was the LBL info, I set initial text to info appears here for selected character. And then the LBL data header, I set the text to click single quote get data, single quote to begin. Just gives them little instructions. Again, these 3, I've set the enabled property on these 3 buttons to false, so that when we start this up, those buttons are grayed out. The user cannot interact with those until they click the Get Data button, load the data, and then they can interact with them. I'm going to double click on the Get Data button. This is where most of our code's going to go. But I want to show you there's 2 ways to create a class. Now, we've been working in a partial class of Form 1. And the reason it's a partial class is the definition of this class, Form 1, occurs in a couple different files. So it occurs here in terms of the code we write. It also occurs in some background files, whereas we're dragging out the interface. It's specifying the properties and the events that we link to those items in another file. So it's defined across multiple files. The classes we're going to create will be defined in one place. And there's 2 ways to do this. We can create a class outside of our Form 1 class. I could create a class here that I'm going to call Comics, and I can then define my class inside the brackets by adding fields, by adding methods, by properties, and so forth. It's fine to do it here. I prefer to do it as a separate file, and then that file can be reused if we wanted to in other projects a little bit easier. So the way we're going to create a new class here, let me get rid of my properties, is I'm going to come over to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right click on my C# project of 15 Comics class, and I'm going to come down to Add, and I can either choose New Item and then find Class in the list, but because we tend to create a lot of classes in Visual Studio, there's actually a direct shortcut to create a new class. So I'm going to click Class. Brings up a dialog. Now again, these are all the different items we could have added, so just simply highlight a class for us. And by default, going to name it class1.cs. So I want to change that name. So I'm going to name it as Comics. And I get a new file called comics.cs. It's opened that up for me. It's in my same namespace of my project, and here is that class file, just like we created at the end of our Form 1 class or after our Form 1 class. It's created the class Comics here within a file that contains the namespace. The Form 1 .cs file already had the namespace, and we were creating the class within that namespace. So now I can start to define my class. We're going to start simply by creating some properties. I'm going to do a little video magic here and just copy and paste to save some time, and then we'll go over each of the code. Okay, so I created 6 variables, and in the class we usually refer to these as fields, and I made these all public. Now in the future we're going to see the best way is to make these private, and we'll talk about the difference between those 2. But by making them public, we can come in and edit these if we ever wanted to from our main form. Eventually we don't want to be able to do that. We want to make the user and ourselves use properties to modify these. But those are our 6 data items that we looked at in the previous video. First name, last name, strip name, type, cartoonist, and year appeared. Now type will be like human, cat, dog, elephant, whatever. They're all strings except for the year appeared I created as an integer, so I could do some math on that to figure out the age based on today's year and subtracting the year appeared. We also have something called a constructor with every class that generates instances of this. And we'll look at that in a little more depth in a future lesson and how we can overload that and provide multiple constructors based on context. But once again, I'm just going to paste in some code here. And here then is our constructor. So our constructor is public and simply is the name of our class. Then I have some parameters that correlate to my 6 fields. Now we'll see later on we can change these and maybe not include all 6 and do some defaults. But for now, we want to populate all 6 fields. We use different names for the strings that are being passed here. So we're going to pass in fn, ln, strip, t, and artist. Those are all strings correlating to first name, last name, strip name, type, and cartoonist. And then the year correlates to the year period. It's an integer. So having passed those in, we then simply set the values of our variables or our fields to those values. So first name equals fn, last name equals ln, strip name equals strip, type equals t, cartoonist equals artist, and year period equals year. That will create an instance of our comics class. Now we're also going to have some methods. We want to provide some operations that we can do on this data. So again, magic of video here, I'm going to paste in some code. So I created 3 methods. The first one is called age. And age returns an integer. Right now it is public, meaning I can access that from our main form. But I'm really going to use it in our display info. So I could make this private. And again, we'll talk about public versus private in a future lesson. For now, I just made everything public. So public age returns an integer, and what I'm doing there is simply getting the current year off the computer. So I'm creating a variable called dt, which is a date time variable, and I'm getting the now property, which pulls the date and time off the system clock of your computer. Out of that dt value, I'm going to pull out the year and assign it to an integer called current year, and then I'm just going to take current year and subtract the year appeared field and return that as the age. Got another method here called display info. Here I used a string builder just to concatenate all the information here. We've got first name plus last name with a space in between. Then I'm going to add a comma, drawn by, add the cartoonist name, comma, first appeared in, and then I'm going to take the strip name, I'm going to convert it to all uppercase just to make the strip name stand out a little bit. Plus, I'm going to concatenate space in space, and the year appeared converted to a string. Then I'm going to append a period, drop down the next line, so I have a new line character. Therefore, comma space, first name, whatever that field is, little string is space, and their age. So when it hits this, it's actually going to come up and run this method and figure out how old that character is. And then we concatenate the value of years old. I'm going to return the string builder converted to a string. So I meet my string data type, and that's that method. Then I have one more method. This one again is a public method called getName. It's going to return a string. All it's going to return is the first name, a space, and the last name. So those are our methods. We can interact with these methods from our Form 1 because they're in the same namespace, and these are public. Let's jump over to our Form 1 CS. And we had our btn get data stub created when we double-clicked that button earlier. Before we code that button, I want to add a couple of class-level variables. And again, I'm going to copy and paste here. I created an array of type comics. Remember, our class is a data type. We can use it as such. So I'm creating an array of instances of our comics. I'm going to call that array comics master. This will contain all the data we're going to read in from our data file. And so I'm going to create a new array. I'm going to limit it to 100 elements. We'll see later on how to use array lists or how to use lists or other collections where we could make this a little more easily expanded if we went beyond 100. But we're going to assume right now we're not going to have more than 100 elements in our array. We might have some wasted space in this array, and that's okay. I have a variable to keep track of the number of records. It's going to start out as 0. And then I'm going to create another comics array. So instances of comics. This one I'm going to call comics displayed. This is going to keep track of which comic characters we are displaying in the LST characters list box. I'm going to also limit it to 100. And the reason I want to do that is because each instance is going to have a index number associated with it. And while I can filter out this comics master and display those items in a list box, when I do that, the individual rows of the list box will not correspond to the indexes of comics master. So the trick here is to do another array that's going to hold the subset of comics master as we work with that data. So right now those arrays are empty. We're going to read in our data and populate these arrays. So let's go down to our btn get data. And again, I'm going to paste in some code. Let me walk you through the code. Before I do that, I notice I'm getting some squigglies here pasting in the code for StreamReader because we also need to add in our directive for system.io. So I'm going to scroll up and add in that directive of using system.io. All right, let's come back down and look at our get data button. So I'm a variable called myFile, which is a type string that's going to contain the path and name of the data file we're using. Then I'm going to use a open file dialog that I've named OFD Open Comics. And I forgot to mention that in our design. So make sure you go back in your design. I didn't put it on the storyboard, but go into dialogs and bring an open file dialog box over to your form. It'll be down in the system tray, and then give it some properties. I named mine OFD Open Comics. I also set the file name to comics.txt. Those are really the only properties that changed. We've looked in the past how we can set the initial directory, how we can set up filters. I didn't bother to do that here. So let's go back into our code. So that's going to show the dialog box and put everything into a try-catch, because when we're working with data files, sometimes things can go wrong. We might choose a file that's in the wrong format. The user might choose cancel and not open up a file. So I want to open my file in the try-catch. So my file equals my open file dialog dot file name. I'm going to create a StreamReader object called SR, and for SR we're going to have it equal to a file dot opentext my file. That's going to open that file. I created a string variable called templine. I created an IDX variable of integer, type integer equaling 0. And then remember, when we looked at that text file earlier, the first line contained header information of the data. So it was first name, last name, strip name, type, cartoonist, and year. I want to ignore that first line. So I'm just going to read in the very first line, sr.readline. But then everything else I want to read in as a while loop until I get to the end of the file. I don't know if there's 10 records there, if there's 1,000 records there. I'm going to read them in one line at a time. Now, I don't want to go beyond 100 in this case. I limited the number of elements in my array to 100 for this demo. So each time through the loop, we're going to read in the next line and put it in temp line. Then I'm going to create a string array called XYZ. I could have named it anything I want. And it's going to take that temp line that we read in and use the split command by the commas. Remember, this is a character, so it's going to be in single quotes. So it's going to separate each of those elements into a string array called XYZ. And then the very first element of that, I'm going to put into a string called first. The next one goes in a string called last. The third element, element 2, index 2, goes into a string variable called strip, and then char type and creator. And then finally on the sixth one, element 5 of that XYZ array, I want to parse that out as an integer and assign it to an integer variable called start. So now we want to populate our array with with an instance of this information. So I'm going to take comicsmaster.idx. IDX again was the counter that we had up here, starting with 0. So this is going to be our first element of comics master. And it's going to equal, and here's where we're going to use that constructor. We're going to call new comics, and we're going to pass it first, last, strip, char type, creator, and start. Now I'm going to jump back over here to, actually I'm going to copy this line just so you can see this. I'm going to come over to our comic CS and come back up here to our constructor of comics, and I'm going to add in a comment here. Okay, so here's the calling statement. So we're calling new comics, and first is going to go into string fn, last are going to string ln, strip goes into strip, char type goes into t, creator goes into artist, start goes into year. I often give these different unique names, but you notice that strip and strip can be the same here. Doesn't really matter. And then when we call that, this is going to take those values and assign them to our field values for this instance. So first name is fn, which was the value of first. Last name takes on the value passed in as ln, which was last, and so forth. So this is going to populate our instance and populate those fields for that instance. Let's go back to our Form 1 CS. And then I'm simply going to increment IDX. So the next time through the loop, we're going to go to array element 1, and then array element 2, and so forth. So read all these in, up to 100. When it's done with that loop, and it's hit the end of the stream of our file, there's no more data to be read in, I want to set num records equal to IDX. And then I'm going to call a method called showAll. We'll come back and create that. I'm going to close my file. I'm going to show a message box of how many records were read in to let the user know that it's done reading. And then I'm going to enable those 3 buttons of showing just the humans, the cats, and the dogs. The user can use those and query the data to those 3 types. And then I have my catch. Hopefully all this works, but if it doesn't, I'm going to catch whatever exception is generated, pass it into a variable called EX, and then use a message box showing the message that was generated by EX, because every exception has a message associated with it, and then my title is something went wrong. So right now we have this method called showAll that I need to create. So that's going to be the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of this extra line of blank line I have here, and come down, and we're going to create the showAll. So here's my showAll method that I've pasted in. I'm going to clear the list box, and then I'm going to call a method called clear comics displayed. I'm going to paste that in as well. So here then is clear comics displayed. So when we show all, it's going to clear the list box. It's going to detour to clear comics displayed, and all I'm doing here is taking a loop that is emptying all the contents of our comics displayed array from 0 to 99, so one less than 100. And all I'm doing is calling comics, and I'm setting all the fields to basically null strings and a 0. Then, coming back up to show all, I'm going to use a loop. I'm going to go through all of those records, and in each of those records, we're going to set comics displayed sub I equal to comics master sub I. So we're basically going to copy our comics master array to our comics displayed array. And then as I'm doing that, I'm going to populate our list box, LST characters, one item at a time, by adding in the comics displayed sub I, and I'm going to call that getName method from the comics class. Remember, getName simply returns the first name, space, and last name. Now, in some of our data, we don't have a last name. Some of the animal characters don't have last names, and that's okay. We'll just get the first name followed by a space. So that populates the array for comics displayed and also populates our list box. Let's go back to our design, because we also have these 3 buttons here for human, cat, and dog. I'm going to double click on the human characters button, show only human characters, my btn humans. My code here will simply be, I'm going to call that showAll method again. For the dog and cat, and I might want to do others, maybe I want to do another button for birds. I'm going to make this a little more extensible by creating a method to extract the data based on a particular type that is passed to it. Once again, I'm going to copy some code in. So here's the method that I called showType, and I'm passing it a string that I'm putting into a parameter named type. So I'm going to clear the list box of all the items. We're going to clear our comics displayed list, so again calling this method up here. So we're going to empty out that array. Going to have a variable called idx, type integer equals 0, and then I'm going to go through a loop from 0 to 1 less than the number of records. Now I could have gone 1 less than 100 and gone through my entire array. I don't really need to do that. Not that that would really matter. So we could change num records here to 100. And then I'm going to use a loop that's going to compare our type of comics master sub I. So we're going through each item of our comics master list. I'm going to convert that to a lowercase, and then I'm going to get the type. So I want to make sure that I pass the type as a lowercase. In fact, just to guarantee that, I'll make one little slight change here. I want to set type also to lower. If it's 0, that means there was a match. The classic master sub I.type is the same as the type we're passing in here as our parameter and setting it to lower. So if that's a match, we're going to set comics display.idx equal to comics master sub I. So it might be the first match is comics master sub 6. In this case, comics displayed sub 0 would equal comic masters sub 6. If it's a match, then we want to populate our list box with that character name, again using the getName method from our comics class, and I'm going to increment idx. The next time through, it'll be the next element of that comics display array. When I'm all done, I'm going to set LBL data header equal to showing only type characters, concatenation here, so it might be showing only human characters, showing only cat characters, showing only dog characters. So one thing I didn't do in the show all was I didn't put this LBL header to showing all records. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come back up here to the show all. And let's put in, so I'm going to change this to being show all characters. Okay, so we've got our show type method created, but we're not using it yet. And we're going to do that with the other two buttons. I'm going to go back to my design, and I'm simply going to select both the show only cat and show only dog, both of those buttons, and if I double click, it'll create stubs for each of those. And here we'll simply call show type, and we're going to pass it dog. And then this one will be show type, and we'll pass it cat. So you can see that by creating this method, we can very easily add in many additional buttons here to query our data with just one simple call to that method. Need my semicolon. And the last thing I want to do is I want to be able to click on an item in our list and display the information down here. So I'm going to double click on my list. That creates a stub for the list box selected index changed event. So here then is my code for selecting a line in the list box. I'm going to create a variable called idx. It's a type integer. I'm going to set it equal to whatever index is selected in the list box, lstCharacters.selectedIndex. So the first line would be 0, the second line would be 1, and so forth. I'm going to use that value then in deciding what to display in lblinfo.text. So lblinfo.text equals my comics displayed array element idx. That's an instance of comics, and I can call then that method from that comics class of display info, and that's going to come to comics.cs. It's going to pull this, it's going to run this method, display info, build a string of all the information I want to display there, and take that, convert it to string, and pass it back as a string, which then gets displayed as the text property of our LBL info label. So there's one last thing we need to do, and that is we need to go get the data file from our Canvas course site. So I've logged into Canvas, gone into the modules area. I'm going to scroll down to find Unit 15. I'm going to open that up, and inside that unit then is my comics.txt file. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to download it. And in the download, I'm going to say open. It's going to open into Notepad, and I'm going to save this. So I'm going to go into my folder containing this project. I'm going to go into the bin folder, the debug folder. So it's with my executable. I'm just going to say save. And then I can close that file. And now back in my project, I'm going to run this. I'm going to click the Get Data button. I'm going to go find my file. I'm going to find my file. I'm going to go into that same bin debug folder. There's my file. I'm going to say open. It tells me 34 records were brought in. There's all my information. If I click on one of these, it tells me the information about that character. And if I choose I want to show only the human characters, oh, we forgot to code the human button. Let's check the cat characters. There's the cat characters and the dog characters. Let's go back and create that human characters. I'm going to go back here. So I always want to thoroughly test our program. I'm going to double click on this. So I'm going to go find that code for btn humans underscore click. Let's change this to show type. And I want to pass it human. Okay, so let's test this. See if this all worked. I'm going to get the data. I'm going to go find my data file. It's going to be in this where I put it in the debug folder. You can put it on your hard drive, put it on a flash drive, wherever you want. Tells me 34 records were brought in. Okay, there's my records. I can click on any one of these, see information about that character. And if I say show only human characters, I can get information about the human characters. I can show only cat characters, or show only the dog characters. Now I probably want a button here to show all the characters. So I'm going to add that in. This will be our last step. And go back to design. I'm going to take the dog characters. Let's set the properties of that button. The text should be show all characters. And we'll name this btn show all. And I need to code that. So here's where that code should have been show all. That's what I was thinking earlier when I coded the human button. I was thinking that was the button to show all. Because I copied and pasted that button, its enabled property is set to false. So I'm going to come back up here to where we loaded our data and make sure that I set btn show all dot enabled equals true. All right, let's test that and see if that now works. So I can get my data. 34 records read in. These all work. Of course, I can scroll down through the list. I want to show only cats. So there's my cats. Show only the dogs. And go back to showing all characters. And the one thing I might want to clean up is it says showing only all characters. So I probably want to make that saying showing all characters. That's a minor fix. Everything seems to be working. And that is our project.